When they arrived near the chopping block on which the boy was chopping the wood, Belle d'Amour said to the old lady, "Bend your head on the block for just a moment. Your bonnet is a little lopsided, and I'd like to put it straight for you." The poor old lady didn't suspect anything and leaned her head on the block. Belle d'Amour made a sign, and the boy with one blow of the axe cut the head off the old woman. The three little girls and the little boy resided for the rest of their lives in the house of pins. They found many treasures and riches, and lived happily ever after. Oh, hello. I didn't see you there. My name is Ian, and today we are talking about Vladimir Propp's functions of the Dramatis Personae. Cool title, huh, kids? This is the meaty chapter from Propp's Morphology of the Folktale. The Morphology of the Folktale was basically, he was a young scholar at the time, but it was basically an exercise in, people are divided about whether to call him a structuralist or a formalist, but basically his issue was this. Most theory, most academic enterprises, particularly when it involves human products, social sciences and the humanities in particular, and folklore kind of nestles into the social sciences and humanities. The theoretical aspects of what we do are basically a way of trying to get a better vocabulary so that we can better understand and communicate to people from outside of that immediate sphere the things that people do. It has to do with, what is theory, really? And theory is basically a decided upon language that is meant to be not contingent on the specifics of its use in the day-to-day life of a particular place, but beyond those scopes, non-situated, non-conditional. The word objective might be not the right term specifically, but fundamentally it is a language, theory is a language that can have applicability in multiple situations. And folklore is very invested in that because we deal with the vernacular so very much. We deal with the intelligent creations of people who do not lack understanding and do not lack a deep understanding. They just don't need to develop a theoretical language to understand what they are talking about because their level of understanding doesn't require communicating outside. It's learned through induction, it's learned through osmosis basically, but it's a deep, intelligent understanding. What theory does is it allows us to take the insights of one group of people and describe them with the same language that we can use to describe the processes of another group of people. And so even if those languages don't necessarily aren't present in either group, we can start to understand these processes as akin to each other, and we can start to make broader and broader discoveries with these patterns. It's a slippery slope, because sometimes we think of things as sort of self-evident. What we think of as using scientific terms are really our own ethnocentric vernacular terms that we have just simply elevated to this status of universal. So when we talk about certain genres and we use our definitions of legend and myth and tale, and then we apply them in other contexts, it's like, well, maybe those boundaries aren't exactly the same, and maybe what we think is a theoretical description is actually a theoretical articulation of a thing is really just like a description, maybe a thick description, but a description nonetheless. So this is Propp's question, basically. We have this thing called the folk tale, or the fairy tale in particular. He's basing it on a narrow group of tales. We recognize it. We recognize it enough that we can sufficiently and intelligently gather them together in things like Auntie Arne's tale type index. We can intelligently and correctly amass them from different contexts and say, yes, these are the same types, and yes, this type and this type and this type are all examples of this larger thing, yes. But what we don't necessarily have is a good understanding of that larger thing. So what is the fairy tale? And we can't base it on things like the presence of fairies, as we already know, because the fairy tale as a term, that's from Andrew Lang's fairy books, and it's just it's a publication quirk more than anything else. We can't all describe them as quests, although there's often a questing. Sometimes the questing is more metaphorical. We can't describe them as all having dragons. We can't describe them as all being young plucky heroes. At least not as sort of like as a universal constant. So how do we understand them? What do we need to do? And Propp's answer was to see if you could actually find the underlying structure of what happens in all tales. And that's what they're basically doing, as I said, is he is trying to give voice to the understanding that we don't give voice to, but we probably already know. The features of this particular kind of narrative that, I'm not going to say that are universal, but are broadly enough attested that we cannot simply understand a text when we read it, but we can create from it. Because again, this idea of what folklorists study, they study the past, and the shift in folklore has sort of happened this way, and that fundamentally they're studying the examples of the past, but the insights that they have, it's kind of incidental in some ways about what happened in the past. But it mimics, it gives an intelligence, and no, I don't want to say that because that implies that other things don't. It gives an explicit articulation of the understanding of what it is to be present to the next telling of it. They're anticipatory. It's an anticipatory understanding, both in terms of its content, in terms of learning repertoires, and in terms of the structures. And he's interested in the structure. What is a fairy tale? Can we actually say what a fairy tale is? And he has a method. And basically, he wants to go deep down and look at all the actions that take place in a fairy tale and see if there is what he calls the Dramatis Personae. The Dramatis Personae are basically the people who do particular kinds of actions on the structural level of tale. Then that structure becomes articulated in a number of ways. And we can talk about the type, and then we can talk about the version. And so we can talk about the type in terms of, okay, we have a hero who is the one who is seeking to have some villainy redressed or have some lack liquidated. And that's more or less a constant. Now, who is the hero in Jack and the Beanstalk? Who is the hero in The Water at the End of the World? Who is the hero in Cinderella? Who is the hero, etc., etc., etc.? That is the characters. Characters, the named actors, are fulfilling particular functions at any given moment. And he imposes this logic. And there's a limited number of functions, and there's a limited number of Dramatis Personae. And that doesn't make sense at first flush, but it will. Trust me, because it's wonderful. So who are the Dramatis Personae? Well, basically, you have a villain. And what the villain does is villainy. He goes out, he struggles with the hero, he pursues the hero, he does something bad. You have donors. Donors going to go give something. The donor is typically going to provide the hero with a magical agent. He's going to do so by setting a test, setting some kind of challenge that the hero will rise to. You've got a helper. Well, the helper helps in a number of different ways. Sometimes the helper will be in the form of being able to transfer the hero from one location to another. Sometimes the hero will perform a test on behalf of the hero, but there's a helper. You have the strange function of the princess and her father. And that's an unusual one because you'd think there would be two. But the princess is often the person who is being sought. And again, I do want to verify that Propp's corpus of legends was a limited number of Russian tales. I'm going to introduce more qualifications as we go. But he had a limited number of Russian tales, and almost exclusively, the tales dealt with, a male, or a presented as male, hero. And they were fairly fiercely heteronormative and binary in their telling. We can talk about this later. But the thing about the princess is the one who is often sought. The princess is often the one who is the victim of a villainy. And why you have the princess and her father as basically one Dramatis Personae is that the father is often going to do things like set difficult tasks to the hero at the end. They're also going to do things like punish. So there's going to be things that logically within the way the story has to fall out, the princess might not be able to actually fulfill those. So the two are often tied into each other. You have the dispatcher. Dispatcher really only ever serves one particular function. And the dispatcher is the one who sends the hero out on the quest, who lets the hero know that there is some villainy that has transpired, some lack that needs to be liquidated, and initiates the hero's movement. You have the hero. I don't think I necessarily need to explain too much about the hero at this stage, but the hero is going to be the person who does something heroic. They are the one who is going to ultimately redress the villainy. They are the one who's ultimately going to liquidate the lack. They are the one who is ultimately going to be rewarded for having done so. You also have the false hero. The false hero will sometimes be trying to do what the hero does. The false hero might make errors along the way. We might actually begin our story thinking that this is the hero, and then he, not always, but often he, fails the tests. And sometimes a second false hero goes out, and he, not always, but often, he fails those tests. And it's only the third time when the actual hero comes out. The false hero might later on decide to present himself as the actual hero and claim reward, at which point there is often a test set by the princess and or her father that the false hero cannot pass, but of course the hero can. It's a limited number of functions. Not all functions are going to be present in all tales. You would be surprised how many functions are present in how many tales. Sometimes functions, whole sort of secondary sections drop out. Sometimes the preparatory section is implied in the telling as opposed to made explicit. And I'll talk about that in a second too. But again, you will be amazed at how much it does work, because it's all basically a logical sequence of events. And here we go. You begin with a preparatory section where you have first some kind of initial situation, some kind of implied stasis. And it is usually, in fact, almost exclusively, it is a stasis that is defined by being a static, safe, secure, and again, given the Eurocentric, patriarchal, heteronormative cultures in which so many of these were collected, typically a standard heteronormative household, parents, children. The implied initial structure is stasis, status quo, that way. We can go back in time and we can find and discover that heteronormativity is not as widespread as we would think. It is not a universal, but it is very, very common, in part because, given the text that we have, that is what our heteronormative collectors collected. So we don't want to push that model as an absolute without denying the fact that much of our data presents this as more than plurality, but the majority of tales. But that initial situation is not irrelevant, even if it's implied, even if the stories begin later on, if the narration in any particular version doesn't happen until section A, or function A, which we'll get to in a second. So then you have a series of pairings. You have some kind of absentation. The family is broken momentarily. Sometimes it's the matter of a parent leaving, sometimes it's the matter of a parent dying, and sometimes it's the matter of a child moving away. Not necessarily departing the family, but a child momentarily away from the safety of the family. So you can consider that. He doesn't even indicate this as a pair, but that might be something that you want to consider as functions of a pair. From that alpha, which is the sign that he gives, to the beta move in this preparatory section, you have wholeness, and then you have fracture. Those two are necessary pairs. You then have some kind of interdiction. Don't do this. You had better do this. Don't forget to do this. And then, of course, once you introduce some kind of rule that cannot be broken, someone's got to break that rule. Oh, you know that someone's got to break that rule. And so again, you have some kind of pairing. You have the function of reconnaissance, where the villain seeks out some information, some kind of advantage over some kind of victim. And of course, eventually, they get that information. They find out something and then can use it to their advantage. They then attempt to use that information. They attempt to deceive some poor victim. And of course, ultimately, they succeed in tricking that victim. Pair, pair, pair. Logical sequence. And because they have succeeded, you have some kind of misfortune, some kind of initial situation. Now, all of that might be implied in the narrative. I want you to think about Cinderella. Go back to classic Cinderella and just think of the Disney version of Cinderella, which has a remarkable amount of integrity to it. And it begins with Cinderella already working in her stepmother's household, no father, the two stepsisters treating her cruelly. You don't know the fall from grace. You're not given that preparatory section in the Disney version. She starts off as a person of some kind of lowly status. And as such, because she starts off in lowly status, it is an unusual fate that befalls her that she is ultimately going to, spoilers if you haven't seen or read Cinderella, ultimately, she is going to ascend to the throne as princess, as a married to the prince. So the whole preparatory section, which you do come across in the Grimm's version, is not present in the Disney version. because it can be implied. So often you have the implication of that situation. In Jack and the Beanstalk, his dad's dead, they're very poor, all they have is this cow. How do they get to that particular situation? In many ways, it doesn't matter, but sometimes it needs to be quite elaborate. When in some of the longer Russian versions, the long tales of the Russian North, like the ones that Korguev told, the initial situation is the family unit is the Tsar and his household, and the child is taken away. For example, in the airplane, the child is taken away, and through a series of convoluted experiments, the child, and then subsequently that child's child, goes to the lowliest of circumstances. And that really, in many ways, all of that is preparatory section. Yeah, think about it. So then you start getting to the meat of the stories, where you get to the very, well, you can tell that it's indicative of something because he stops using the Greek letters and he starts using the Roman alphabet to talk about the various functions. And the first one is villainy. This is the thing that you need. This is the precipitating incident. If you don't have this, you don't have a story. The villainy is either someone has done something to a person directly, there is some kind of act of a villain, or it could be some kind of lack is in place. It could be the father has fallen sick and a remedy is required. It could be penury, it could be poverty, and therefore money is needed. So it's not a villainy that is a consequence of a particular actor, but it is something that needs to be redressed. That villainy is made known to the hero. And there's two kinds of heroes. There is the hero who is a seeker, basically, that the villainy happened to someone else. And then he goes off, he is told, the information is communicated to him, and he decides to take on the role of seeker. The flip side is that he's a victimized seeker, and that the villainy has been done to him, and he is redressing that villainy somehow. So he is going out and seeking it in some kind of, solving his own problems, basically. And then you have, as I said, the dispatcher. Really, the dispatcher is someone who only comes around and says, hey, this has happened. I want to take one brief pause here, because the thing about the connection between the Dramatis Personae and the character is that it isn't necessarily a one-to-one relationship. First of all, you can have situations where one character fulfills the role of both a donor and a helper. They could even fulfill the role of a dispatcher. The hero can also be his own or her own dispatcher, where, oh, Dad is sick, I must do something about this. And so you really don't have the character anymore. One moment, the action communicating the villainy to the hero is done by the same character that is the hero themselves. So it shows through the general applicability, because Propp is focused on particular actions and then how they're manifested. The other thing is that, particularly in longer and compound tales, a dispatcher could come in the form of 3 people. A donor could come in the form of 3 people. And what is more, it is not entirely impossible for the hero to come in the form of people, because you might get so far in the narrative and then the hero basically has some kind of incident where the next set of actions are fulfilled by a different character, so that character has assumed the mantle of, or assumed the Dramatis Personae of hero. It gets complicated, but it gets fun. So, Ah! Villainy. Oh no! A villainy has happened! Mediation, the connective incident. Aha! Beginning the counteraction. The hero agrees to seek out, to redress, and then goes. Moves, departure. Movement is an important thing. The movement away from that situation. And again, the hero often has some kind of initial situation. The hero, of course, can be the person upon whom the villainy has been acted, or someone in his family who can be the victim, and the hero can be a member of that family who seeks to redress, or whatever. But basically, the hero removes themselves entirely from that social setting and is on their own. And the is on their own is an important aspect, which we can get to later. But you'll kind of want to think of things. This similar pattern is kind of, and I emphasize that kind of in that strange tone of voice, kind of what Joseph Campbell, who folklorists hate, but what Joseph Campbell was kind of getting at in Hero of a Thousand Faces. They hate him because he was an anti-Semite, because he was selective with his sources, because he had some kind of like feel-good, self-actualization narrative that he then drew from world mythology and folklore to try and justify as a universal constant. How is that different from what Propp is doing? For one thing, Propp did the research, and another thing is that Propp wasn't nearly as selective as Campbell was. But Campbell has certainly taken a huge amount of the wind out of many folklorists' sails because of the popularity of Joseph Campbell in particular, because he became a television celebrity and he became embraced by people like George Lucas, and there's that Joseph Campbell Bible, basically, that someone produced for screenwriters in the mid-1980s, and that this is the hero's journey. So we can pee on Joseph Campbell's ashes just a little bit, but just as importantly, we can nevertheless assert that there is something to be said about the narrative of the young unlikely person who goes out and absents themselves from the familiar and works himself in the world and progresses that way. It doesn't have to be once across the sea and under, into the earth and all the sort of vaguely Jungian archetypal things that Campbell was suggesting. But the idea of striking out on one's own and taking the initiative and doing it seems to be one of the larger functions, the larger constants in folktale and fairy tale. And then you have this great sort of triumvirate, the DEF. The D is the circumstances are suggested for some kind of test. The DEF is basically a test triptych. So the donor suggests some kind of test to the hero. The hero reacts to the donor's suggestion, hopefully succeeds. And when they succeed, the donor gives the hero some kind of magical agent. That magical agent is going to help him on his quest, often through, maybe it's a weapon, maybe it's a flying horse, maybe it's a helper, and they can fly away. But what is important is that you have a series of tests. You often have a series of tests. As I said, sometimes the false hero is going to come, the donor is going to challenge, and the false hero is going to fail, and then does not get the magical agent. And then, wonk, and then the false hero comes back, doesn't get the magical agent, or the second false hero, and it's only the true hero. Now, it doesn't have to be a test in the way we understand tests. Often they are subtle things, like they're tests of kindness. And oh, pity me, oh, I'm such a poor beggar boy, please give me some alms. And then, no, failed test, no, failed test. Of course, you can have half my supper, and you can have my hat. And then lo and behold, thank you, and behold, and because of this, take this egg. An egg? What'll I do with an egg? Boom! Flying dinosaur, mother flippers. So you have that. I'm using these And you might have noticed that almost all video games are fundamentally DEFs the entire time. There's some kind of test, some kind of combat, some kind of trick, and you just get more and more stuff. Video games are basically just these DEFs, the slow accrual of magical agents. You get mushrooms, you get bells, you get Yoshis, you get whatever you require, Tanuki suits, and then lo and behold, it'll help you on your quest. Legend of Zelda is all of that because you get more and more armor, you get better and better swords and so on, so it's just the accumulation of goods. You don't have that nearly as often in traditional Tale, but you do have compound tests, definitely. So the DEF is a sequence that is often repeated. So when he's describing it in this chapter once, bear in mind that so many of these things can be repeated over and over and over again. So having had the test, spatial transference. He continues on his way. You know, he has left home, but he can basically, this is when he is able to transfer himself to a different kingdom of some description. Here's where it starts to get confusing because you wouldn't think it would happen this early. Eventually, he struggles with the villain. Eventually, that's going to happen. He struggles with the villain. Struggle, struggle, struggle. Sometimes he is branded or marked. And branding can be in the form of a scar. I lost my eye. Or branding can be in the form of getting some kind of new outfit. Oh, look at me. And so, you know, it doesn't necessarily need to be a terrible kind of branding. It can be a fortunate kind of branding. But anyway, in some kind of struggle. And then the villain is defeated. Sometimes the villain is killed right there. Boom. Killed. You're done. Now again, you can start compounding your tales. Because sometimes you would get to this point and the villain is, you think it's the villain, but lo and behold, it's not the villain. It's just like a mini-boss. And it's like, oh no, someone reemerges as a dispatcher and says, yeah, that wasn't the villain. Princess is in a different kingdom. And then you go all the way back. You go all the way back to C. You go all the way back to, I guess I got to go to this next one, C, D, E, F. And then you keep on going back into H and I, and then again. And then again. Struggle, 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 struggle. Over and over and over again. But sometimes you defeat the villain. At that time, often the situation ends. The villainy is over. It has been redressed. The princess has been rescued. The lack has been liquidated. And lo and behold, in many instances, the stories simply end there. Or, as I said, the story just continues. The hero returns home and is potentially subject to some other villainy. Or, as I said, at least in our narrative world, we discover that it's not a false villain. I don't want to introduce that concept, but basically that it was only one of many villains, and it becomes a compounding of this narrative because we can complexify. But what's going to happen is that the exact same set of functions are going to be repeated through different characteristics, through different actions on the level of story. So it'll be both the same as and different from before. But you can compound tales over and over again. So if there's a pursuit, if someone starts chasing after the hero, well, then the hero is rescued at some point. And then eventually they get back. They get to two different places. One is either returns home, back to that initial socio-context, or arrives in a different kingdom. But basically, wherever the possibility of recognition for their heroism is going to be taking place. So whether he's returning home and demonstrating that the lack has been liquidated, or the villainy that has been done to his own place has been fixed. Or conversely, if he was just on a classic princess rescue, he went on to ZipRecruiter, looked up, his dispatcher was like, oh, a princess needs rescuing, and then please deliver to the kingdom of Zul. It goes to Zool, and that's what happens. But he's often, unrecognized. He's being marked. He's being branded. Maybe he's in disguise. He's not known to be the hero. Meanwhile, there might be a false hero kicking around. And this false hero could be the same character as is the villain. We do not know necessarily. But at this point, they are a false hero because they are making claims to having been the actual hero. And so some kind of test is set. And Propp calls it the difficult task. And he wants to distinguish the difficult task from the test. And the way you distinguish a difficult task from a test is that if at the end of the difficult task, you get recognized as the hero and often rewarded with the princess, then that is a task. If you receive a magical agent, then that is a test. So, be forewarned. Now, these are in a logical sequence. They might actually appear out of order as clusters, but he is trying to bring it down to the most logical possible string. Subsequently, in the morphology, because as you see and as you read, there are little, as I said, alpha through lambda, and then all the A's and B's and C's to provide one little sign for analyzing a text. He then takes these sequences, and this is what this text is like, this is what this text is like, which is just a string of letters and arrows and so on. And you would think that all of them would be, what? Alpha through lambda, and then A through W, and then that's it. And no, there's all over the place, and that's a huge compound. And I'll be putting a couple on the screen right here just to sort of show you what is meant by these sort of strings of letters. But they still have a logical sequence. So he's presenting these functions in their most linear, but they don't necessarily always happen in this. So you have this pairing. You have the difficult task is set. The solution is found by the hero. The solution is not found by the false hero. And then ultimately the hero is recognized. And of course, the false hero is exposed. Perhaps the clearest and most common example of the false hero test at the end of a narrative, when someone arrives unrecognized, has been marked, has been branded, is of course in Cinderella, where all of a sudden, I don't know why do I always say all of a sudden, the prince is now looking, and the prince fundamentally, the prince in Cinderella is doing the Dramatis Personae of the princess and her father, because that's just the way that Propp's narrative works. So the prince shows up and sets this difficult test. And the test is about being able to recognize, or really the hero proving themselves the hero by how they were branded. And how is Cinderella branded? Well, she leaves her shoe. So there's this token, this proof of concept, or this proof of identity of the shoe. So the prince shows up, and the first stepsister is the false hero, is false hero number one, and puts on the shoe. And in the Grimm's version of Cinderella, of course, she's like, I can't put the shoe on. And her stepmother, I don't have a stepmother one. Her stepmother says, well, you're going to be a princess. Why don't you just keep on chopping off pieces of your foot until it fits in that shoe? And because you don't need to walk. And they think that's a good idea. And so it gets all the way. It's like, hey, this is my princess. And they go halfway to the castle, and then these birds come out of nowhere. I'll explain that. No, I won't. Read it. These birds say, hey, look, there's blood coming out of her shoe. You really think that's the right one? And the prince like, what? And takes this back to the store. It's like, this is broken. And so like the next stepsister comes and like same thing. It's like, I can't fit in this shoe. And the stepmother says, cut pieces of your foot off. You don't need to walk. Just keep on whittling down that hog until, lo and behold, you can get your foot in there. And does so. And the prince is like, oh, my princess. And go, blood and shoe, birds, what's going on? Return. And then it's only when, well, I guess I have this third daughter, you can try her shoes on, slipped right there, perfect proof of life. Here, the false hero is often typically punished at this time, or if the false hero is the villain, they are punished. The villain often is punished by death earlier in struggle, but not necessarily. The villain could have somehow survived at this point. The punishment might not be the form of death. The punishment might be the form of exile or something, or banishment, or just sort of overt disapproval. Really depends, but fundamentally it happens. The hero is transformed in some way. If they have been maimed in their branding, they are healed. If often they, at the very least, they are transformed from perhaps their lowly outfits to splendid raiment, and lo and behold, they have achieved the full transformation from the lowly, unlikely, least likely person from that humble circumstances to ascending the throne, because it ends fundamentally, almost inevitably, with a wedding. And the hero and the princess wed. Sometimes they just go to a party and dance over the closing credits. But for the most part, there's some kind of celebration. And what's happened is that they are now at some kind of new stasis. They are in some kind of heteronormative bond. They are adults, and they are going to have lots and lots of babies, and they are going to return to a situation that is almost like situation alpha, almost like that initial calm stasis at the very, very beginning. Yes, when functions are performed by different characters, there's a hero, then someone else is a hero, the narratives develop a means of communicating information from one to another. So yes, if the hero needs to be transferred, if the function of the Dramatis Personae, that is the hero, needs to move from one character to another, there's going to be some kind of strategy that communicates that. The idea of trebling, the idea of things happening in threes, is kind of critical, and something that we see a lot. Threes in Russian, certainly. Threes throughout Europe. Fours in other world cultures, as Alan Dundas pointed out. Three is not a universal number. It is a frequent number in our most immediate reference pool. But as we cast our eyes beyond our, and I'm using our in terms of an 18th, 19th, and 20th century European folklorist, as we cast our eyes beyond our own meager borders, we see that the things that we understood as universals are historically conditioned, and even if they're broadly attested, that doesn't mean that they are universally universal truths. Propp is wonderful. If you can, I would read all of Morphology of the Folktale. It is not, actually no, I was going to say it's not fun, but it is fun. It's very fun. Some people have suggested, David Buchan for one, who is a folklorist. Okay, here's two more things that I wanted to say. One is that you are probably going to come across tales where it just doesn't seem to work to the satisfactorily enough that you think that it is wholly valid. And that is a good hesitation. But what's just as important is not necessarily his findings, although I still would hold that his findings are remarkably rich and remarkably applicable to a remarkable amount of tales, but really in terms of what his method is. Because fundamentally, as he starts with these functions, and then he starts analyzing the tales and what fits into these functions or not, he starts to then, okay, well, now using my theory, what are these, in my structure, what are the various tales? And so, well, maybe we can now type them. And we're not typing them according to, they all involve a test of shoe, like Cinderella, or they all involve a wolf, like Little Red Riding Hood, but they all do not have the false hero motif, or they all have a compound or a treble a treble test or something along those lines. So maybe we'll type them according to variations to the structure, which doesn't necessarily demonstrate a variation in the method. It's just like, well, which of these forms are in place? Do we talk about tails that curtail at the end of function k? Maybe we do. That's fine. But think about his method. David Buchan took his method and applied it to revenant ballads. So, ballads about ghosts. And that, yeah, okay, well, he discovered that there's basically 4 Dramatis Personae, and I believe, number off the top of my head, I think he developed 17 functions. And so he's using Propp's method without using Propp's findings, because Propp's findings are for a fairly conservative group of narratives, of the Russian North, as collected by Afanasyev, as compiled by Afanasyev, and very much of a type. So the fact that it isn't necessarily universally applicable is a lot having to do with this particular method. Now, what I was going to say is there's a criticism in that you can make an argument that this is a bad translation, and it's a bad translation that we have had for over 50 years, and that maybe someone should, if that translation will ever be out of copyright, do a new one. And because sometimes the translators were ambiguous between when they were saying character and when they were saying Dramatis Personae, and we perhaps need some more precision. But this is great. One of the things about the study of any kind of theory is that theory's never done. Theory is a historical snapshot as much as anything else. And so Propp is an incredibly important moment, and he's going to be used in other things. I don't typically do this with the videos, but after this video, I think you should also watch the one I'm going to be preparing, and they'll be up at basically the same time, about Bengt Holbeck's Language of Fairy Tales, because Holbeck builds on Propp, and all the things that I've been talking about in terms of the question of what is happening. Some of them get at least proposed answers in Holbeck, because, and here's the point, Propp thought that the first thing that you needed to do when you're going to analyze the folk tale as a thing is to actually try and figure out what it is. What is this thing? What are its features? What are its structures? What are its forms? Only then can you start to ask why. Okay, if we now know what the tale is, why is it this way? Why is it only these 31 functions? Why is it as invariant as it is on the structural level, despite the fact that it is also open to so much creativity and variation on the level of type and version? What is it about the deep, almost invariant structure about this is how we tell these kind of stories? And why? What does it say? I don't think he thinks that fairy tales are hardwired into our psychology. They're not archetypal in that way, but they are almost inevitable responses to the almost inevitable consequences of being human. And once we think of tale in those terms, hopefully we can start to radically reimagine the why of their telling and the why they continue to be told. That's it for now. This was fun. This is messy, but this is fun. I bid you well, as I always do, my friends.